Now, back to this problem of people not daring to speak up or not being allowed to. That's a real problem now when it comes to discussing some critical challenges faced by the West, like mass immigration and Islam. I'll give you an example. Boris Johnson. He recently resigned in protest as Britain's Foreign Secretary, and the other day he said Muslim women wearing niqabs look like letterboxes. That's his opinion. But Britain's most senior police officer, Met Commissioner Cressida Dick, actually investigated whether Johnson's quip broke the law.
I spoke last night to my very experienced officers who deal with hate crime.
Now, great, Dick, on balance, said she thought no offence had been committed, but what business was this of the police? Meanwhile, the British government's running its own investigation into Johnson. Well, Douglas Murray is associate editor of The Spectator and the author of a bestseller, The Strange Death of Europe, warning about the danger of mass immigration from the Muslim Third World. Murray is in Australia on a lecture tour, and I spoke to him a short while ago. Douglas Murray, thank you so much for joining me. What does it tell you when even Boris Johnson, an MP and former Foreign Secretary, is investigated by the police chief herself for saying that women in the niqab look like letterboxes?
Well, it says to me that I'm very glad I left my country and come to Australia. It's an incredible demonstration of the sort of frivolity and cowardice that's going on in my own home country. Boris Johnson merely made a comment, a passing comment in a newspaper article, which was itself the main argument in this article, was an opposition to a burqa ban of the kind that has been enforced in France and now in Denmark, among other countries in Europe. He was opposing the burqa ban and saying we shouldn't have it in Britain for the following liberal reasons. And in passing said, you know, these are ridiculous, absurd garments. And he said that the people who wear it can look like bank robbers and look at letterboxes, and I mean, this kind of crisis should occur from that, I think, tells us quite a lot of things. But most obvious is the extraordinary cynical political opportunism of people who keep on crying that they are deeply offended by comments about other people's garments, and on this occasion, a garment which I mean, it's extraordinary. The left in Britain now seems to be on the side of the burqa. Which is not the position you'd have expected them to necessarily come to in this year.
No, I do recall they made a career and made a big thing about 40 years ago about throwing away all clothing whatsoever. Now they want women dressed up head to toe in a bag. I don't understand it. But Douglas, I just wonder, I mean, it's like the more self-imposed censorship that we saw of the Danish cartoons that mocked Islam. I wonder whether this suggests that mass immigration, especially from the Muslim or Third World countries, creates such tensions, or is believed to create such tensions, that Western countries now crack down on free speech to stop those tensions from becoming either too obvious or from exploding into violence.
Well, that's a very interesting and important point. It's actually the man who commissioned those cartoons in Denmark you mentioned in 2005, a friend of mine, Flemming Rose, who instigated for free speech reasons this thing that unfortunately became a sort of global crisis. He wrote a book a few years ago, a very interesting book called The Tyranny of Silence, in which he made the absolutely central point on this, which is that people who by and large argue for multicultural societies seem to have arrived at the decision that in a very diverse society you've got to crack down on speech because we basically can't cope with the diversity of speech we're going to have. And Flemming Rose made the important point in that book, actually, those people in favour of multiculturalism and those of us who just live with multiculturalism, whether we like it or not, actually have to come to the opposite conclusion, which is the more diverse your society, the more wide-ranging and considerable the amount of speech is going to have to be in the society. You can't crack down on the speech. You're going to have to get used to it. And unfortunately for those people, that includes people like Boris Johnson, people like me and others who want to ensure that we have the right to make frivolous jokes and also tell truths. And we're not giving that up. And so I think that the faster people learn that, the better.
Well, you say you're not giving it up, but the British police seem most determined to ensure that you do, cracking down on all sorts of people in the street. I mean, if Boris Johnson wasn't a former minister, he's just some guy at Hyde Park standing on a soapbox, I think he'd be in a lot more strife than he is already.
Well, that's possible, but I just say Cressida Dick, the head of the Metropolitan Police, who disgracefully announced that they had looked into this and there didn't seem to be enough. It didn't quite meet the bar of a sort of hate crime in the UK. First of all, London is experiencing extraordinary rise in violent crime, including an unprecedented rise in knife crime, which is meaning a murder almost every evening in London. The fact that in the middle of that wave that the Metropolitan Police claim not to be able to get on top of, or can't seem to get on top of, they'd be looking into Burqa-gate, is preposterous. But what I'd like to know, and what I want to ask of Cressida Dick, the head of the Metropolitan Police, is okay, if making a joke about the burqa in this way in the main Conservative newspaper, The Telegraph, is nearly a hate crime but not quite, what is a hate crime in this situation then? Is everything other than praise of the burqa some kind of hate crime? Because if she'd tell us, I'm very happy to break whatever the new pathetic law that she's willing to enforce should be.
Now, Douglas, you referred to the extraordinary amount of the number of deaths by knife crime in London. Now, it's quite interesting when you go through the list of victims. Now, I stress victims, but I suspect if you did the same with perpetrators, you get the same result. It seems a very, very amazing insight to the level of immigration in Britain. There's not too many, Cartwrights and Murrays in that list of victims. Right. Which takes me to your book, The Strange Death of Europe, where you confront this mass immigration and the changing of the cultures of cities, and you argue that Europe is facing a kind of cultural suicide. Can you just elaborate on that, and maybe with reference to what's happening, what you see in London today?
Yes, I mean, I've been travelling across the continent for many years, very intensely, going to the places where people arrive in and going to many of the places they end up going to. And, nothing is more significant in a society than the rate, speed and nature of migration into that society. And it's a question we're all grappling with. Australia is very obviously grappling with it as well. But you have a set of things that go on, and one of them is a certain type of person, particularly people in political power who've made bad decisions, who don't want people to notice what's in front of their eyes. I was very struck at one point in my research, in another trip to France, speaking to a French public figure, and I said, I was trying to get the stats for that latest year, and this person turned to me, he's a critic of the mass migration, and said to me, I don't believe the figures anymore. I don't believe them. They're lies. And he said, what I believe is my eyes. And I thought that went to a striking truth about this, which is that, a lot of the stats on this have been hazy. A lot of the figures have been deliberately ignored. I mean, in France, you can't even collect figures about ethnic and religious crimes because the government won't collect the figures. And so people just are left being told that what their eyes can tell them, and what, for instance, as you say, a morning newspaper that reveals yet another victim and the identity of yet another victim in the London knife crime wave is just not of any importance. And I think this whole thing is poison. I think that it's poisonous to ignore the facts that are in front of people's eyes or tell them that their eyes are lying, because otherwise they're going to come to far worse conclusions of their own, even than they're going to already.
You described to a T what is happening in Victoria, where I think public faith in the police honesty in describing the rate of Sudanese crime, which they once denied was out of the ordinary, I think has been absolutely shattered. Now, you are worried about the mass immigration in Britain, but I wonder what you would say of the challenge here in Australia when our population growth rate is 3 times higher than that of Britain's. It's 1.6% last year, with a full 1% of that in a single year coming from immigration. What do you make of that?
Well, these stories are similar and slightly different, of course. I mean, this country has not had the kind of mass illegal migration that Europe has actually encouraged in recent years, that Angela Merkel famously encouraged in 2015. You know, for all the criticisms one can make of this country's policies, I mean, you have had politicians in recent years who have at least said that the difference between legal and illegal matters, that the law matters. So there are specifics of that. I just say, you know, the thing I always say about this subject is you don't have to be against all immigration. Almost nobody is against all immigration, but you've got to be careful with your society. This is the thing that Europeans have become so bad at. You've got to be careful with it. You've got to choose carefully. And unfortunately, if you don't, you end up in this situation you describe, which affects absolutely every aspect of the state. It affects the welfare state, it affects your security, and it affects, I mean, just that example you give of the police. Every public body, including the police, ends up in this position of having to sort of navigate between the general public and the facts. Instead of representing the public, they decide that their job is to sort of stand equidistant between the facts and the public and sort of adjudicate between them, just in case the public get the facts wrong. And so it affects everything. And I just think that most developed countries are very, very far behind the sort of debate we need to have on these matters. Migration is going to affect any country for a long time to come, for good and ill. And what we've come to is we can discuss all the good bits, and there are good bits, but people cannot discuss the bad bits, and there are bad bits, because of the incredible frivolous and insincere accusations that get thrown around. It's not crazy, it's not phobic, it's not bigoted to be concerned about the most important thing we have, which is welfare states and nations which have to be able to decide who can be in and also who should be out.
Douglas Murray, thank you so much indeed for your time.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
After the break, the panel, and you will not believe the racist abuse and threats now hurled at our most inspiring young political talent.